And for those first 10 people who buy the book after my talk, you get a copy of a gorgeous cherry red condom with my book cover on it. Because I am promoting safe sex always to the wrong demographic when I give this talk. When I gave this talk at Brandeis, the kids couldn't wait till it was over. They all ran down and grabbed the condoms. But it's different with adults. You probably have grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whatever. So they're here. Scene 1. In 1952, Mabel Dodge Luhan wrote to her doctor, Eric Hausner, "This last week I sorted and lifted and sweated over 1,000 pounds of paper, supervised the packing of 11 steel-taped wooden boxes, and shipped it to the library in New Haven this morning, but did not lose a pound myself." The paper she donated to the Beinecke Library at Yale University contained Luhan's unexpurgated self, 20 volumes of memoirs, and thousands of pages of manuscripts, letters, and scrapbooks that would allow scholars, so far mainly myself, to continue her life's project. It was this half-ton of material on which Luhan drew when she wrote her 4-volume, 1,600-page memoir that was published by Harcourt Brace in the 1930s. She wrote to Gertrude Stein's brother Leo in 1935 that she had a socially as well as personally therapeutic purpose in writing them. It entailed, Luhan told him, lifting, quote, "the veil on the whole ghastly social structure under which we were buried, and that must be torn down and exposed so those who follow us will have peace and freedom to make a different one," end quote. She did not, however, reveal in her published memoirs that 3 of her 4 husbands were infected with syphilis.
Wow.
At the time, she never did anything in a small way. At the time Luhan donated her papers to Yale, she had all but passed from public attention, although during her heyday in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the media hailed her as a national institution. Writers and artists who were seeking to define the transition from the Victorian to the modern era appropriated her and her life story, perhaps more than that of any other American woman in the first half of the 20th century. For modern writers like Gertrude Stein, D.H. Lawrence, and legions of others, Mabel emblematized the new woman in her various incarnations as a liberating life force for social and sexual experimentation and as a castrating devourer of men. Very few women can play both those roles. This is Mabel, 1918, the month that she landed in Taos, New Mexico. Luhan's intimate memories, as she called them, traced her development from 1879, from her birth in Buffalo, New York, to upper-class Victorian parents whose mutual loathing and emotional abandonment of their daughter instigated her endless quest for love and power. Through her expatriation in Florence, Italy, to her triumphant hostessing of a radical salon in Greenwich Village from 1913 to 1915 that aired the grievances and hopes of socialists, anarchists, free lovers, feminists, and modern artists, ending with her 1917 flight from Western civilization into the arms of Antonio Lujan, her Taos Pueblo Indian lover. This is Tony Lujan, about the same time, 1918. And this is the house that Mabel built, which I will not talk much about, except because I've written many, many books and given many talks about it, but it's still open. It's a bed and breakfast. It's a retreat. There are workshops there for writing, photography. It is an absolutely wonderful place to stay. It's on the edge. It borders the edge of Taos, 60,000 acres of Taos Pueblo. And to this extraordinary home, 18 rooms, a 1,200-foot gatehouse, a house for servants, and 5 guest houses that she built between 1919 and 1929, Mabel brought some of the greatest artists, writers, philosophers, psychologists, and social activists of her time. D.H. Lawrence, Ansel Adams, Georgia O'Keeffe, Leopold Stokowski, Martha Graham, even Carl Jung ended up there because of Mabel, although she wasn't home at the time he arrived. He knew that she wouldn't be. Mabel began her memoirs in 1916 during her first talk therapy. as revealed in the astonishing annotations written on top of the case notes taken by her first Freudian analyst, Smith Eli Jelliff. Reading her published memoirs during the 1930s, Jelliff discovered some of the exact same phrases that he had taken down in his notes also appeared in her memoirs, even though Mabel had no access to those notes until 1945, after he died, when she wrote to his wife and asked her to return them. These proved to be a treasure trove to me, 60 pages of case notes from her 1916 therapy. Although Mabel engaged in many kinds of therapy throughout her adult life to deal with her diagnosed manic depression, the memoirs that she wrote over the course of 30 years, beginning in 1924 and ending in 1954, were, I believe, what saved her life. It is, of course, not news that writers suffering from mental and physical ailments use writing as therapy. Perhaps the most striking comparative example I came upon in my new research is Isak Dinesen, whose Out of Africa, written during the agonizing pains of tertiary syphilis, was published in 1937 at exactly the same time that Mabel's last and most popular memoir, Edge of Taos Desert, An Escape to Reality, was published. This is Dinesen on her first safari in 1918 in Kenya. Both women constructed their respective countries, Kenya and New Mexico, as lost paradises whose indigenous peoples were morally superior to Europeans and Euro-Americans. To borrow the words of Dinesen's biographer Judith Thurman, the art of memoir served them both as a divine repair job. Scene 2. In 1973, Emily Hahn and Ellen Bradbury, who some of you may know, since she's a Santa Fe resident, were sitting in the reading room of the Beinecke Library at Yale reading the Mabel Dodge Luhan papers. Hahn was under contract to Houghton Mifflin to write a biography of Luhan, and Bradbury, a doctoral student, was beginning a dissertation on her. Bradbury came across something she thought Hahn had to see. A few moments later, Hahn shouted, "Syphilis," turning all heads in the room. And you should know that you're not even supposed to breathe loudly in the Beinecke reading room. I've had things taken away from me. I've been reprimanded in the Beinecke reading room. Donald Gallup, the then curator of American literature, was shown the manuscript they were reading, The Statue of Liberty, A Story of Taboos. Within a short time, it, along with most of Luhan's unpublished memoirs, were disappeared. In April 1973, John Evans, Luhan's only child, signed over to Gallup the decision of what materials to restrict to the year 2000, when presumably everyone but me would be dead, but he didn't know about me then. Scene 3. When I began my research on Mabel Dodge Luhan, a few months after the papers were put away, at least some of them, in the summer of 1974, what I now call the syphilis papers were not available. At the time I published my biography of Mabel in 1984, I knew from Emily Hahn's biography that Mabel had contracted syphilis from Tony Luhan. But like Hahn, I mentioned it only in passing. In the late 80s and 90s, some of these restricted papers were open, and I was at the Beinecke in late 90s doing some research for an essay on the challenges of writing feminist biography when I came across a newly released manuscript titled Doctors, 50 Years of Experience, written in 1954 when Mabel was 75 years old. The memoir stunned me as I followed Luhan's accounts of her multiple encounters with venereal disease beginning in 1900 at age 21 when she was married and engaged in a long and self-destructive love affair with the most prominent and also married doctor in Buffalo, John Parmenter. At one point, he told Mabel, quote, "That damn bitch of Dr. Sherman's has given me the clap." And she responded, "Give it to me, and I will take it from you." And throwing himself upon me, he did. Mabel's second husband, Boston architect Edwin Dodge, revealed his syphilis to her before marriage, promising her that he was no longer infectious so that they could have sexual relations. Mabel's third husband, post-impressionist painter Maurice Stern, who had lived Gauguin-like in Bali for 2 years before he came to New York, had his second stage syphilis discovered in Psychoanalysis with Mabel's psychiatrist. Mabel's fourth and last husband, thank goodness, Tony Lujan, contracted syphilis from the wife of a clan brother at Taos Pueblo and brought it back to Mabel, who for the first time seems to have manifested clear symptoms that had to be treated. Is it possible, Mabel wrote at the end of her final memoir, after revealing all these horrors, that there is so much venereal disease in the world? Well, for 10 years, Lujan's question has become my obsession, to the point where all my friends know that I assume everyone has syphilis unless they can prove to me otherwise. At the time Mabel was first exposed to gonorrhea and syphilis in the early 1900s, the medical profession had declared a venereal epidemic. The leading American venereologist, Dr. Prince Morrow, estimated that 80% of the men in New York had contracted gonorrhea, a disease to which he and other doctors attributed 50% of the sterility in women, and that 5 to 18% of American men had syphilis. What were the symptoms and treatments for VD before penicillin became the first certain cure in 1946? Women who contracted gonorrhea could experience frequent and painful urination, vile-smelling vaginal discharges, infections of the uterus, fallopian tubes, and pelvic organs, diseased ovaries, and reduced fertility. Syphilis showed itself through genital sores that ulcerated soon after the initial infection, followed in a few weeks by a variety of problems that could include skin lesions, rashes, head and joint aches, mouth sores, and swollen lymph glands. Statistics about the percentage of men who contracted VD before penicillin became easily available are notoriously difficult to ascertain. But Alan Brandt, the author of the best social history of VD in the U.S., No Magic Bullet, suggested to me in a phone conversation that somewhere between 10 and 50% of American men may have contracted gonorrhea or syphilis in the early decades of the 20th century, many more of them gonorrhea than syphilis, which suggests how extraordinarily widespread and serious a problem it was. During its latency period, which lasts a few years to a lifetime, 30 to 40% of those infected with syphilis develop tertiary syphilis, which involves massive systemic damage that can include blindness, deafness, skeletal atrophy, heart disease, insanity, and early death. In the 1930s, it was estimated that 20% of those incarcerated in what we used to call insane asylums suffered from syphilitic paresis. At that time, 60,000 babies died annually from congenital syphilis, inherited through syphilitic mothers. And those who didn't die suffered serious birth defects, a fate that Mabel might have spared what would have been her second child by aborting Edwin Dodge's baby. Edwin Dodge was dosed with mercury. Maurice Stern, Mabel, and Tony Lujan received intravenous shots of salvarsan, an arsenical compound given over the course of several months that seems to have prevented the disease from progressing for most people. But it, like mercury, was highly toxic. These, of course, are just the pathological ramifications of VD. As we know from the many scholars who have written about the social and cultural constructions of epidemic diseases, they have a power far beyond their physiological consequences. Lujan located herself in a 500-year-old tradition of blame when she wrote in her unpublished memoirs, quote, "The verse in the Bible about the sins of the fathers being visited upon the children unto the fourth, third, and fourth generation has worried me all my life. I wondered if my father's sins were visited upon me, and if I must die from his wages of sin, the wages of sin being death." The sins of the fathers was a Victorian euphemism for men who brought syphilis home and infected their wives and children. If God or Mother Nature had wanted to develop a disease that would punish men and women for sex in the most frightful ways imaginable, he or she would have had to have invented syphilis. It is not only a disease whose symptoms mimic many other infectious diseases, but it has been, since Columbus, portrayed here greeting the Indians of Hispaniola, purportedly brought it back as the curse of the Americas he had conquered. the single most shame and guilt-ridden disease on the planet, at least until AIDS, whose etiology and cultural manifestations strikingly resemble it. From the time of the Renaissance on, syphilis has been blamed on the marginal and the despised, prostitutes, immigrants, Jews, and homosexuals, as the sources of society's pollution and the wages of sin. A few examples. Pope Leo XII banned rubber condoms in 1922, not because they prevented conception, but because they protected infected syphilitics from the suffering they so richly deserved. Early 20th century so-called progressive doctors preferred middle and upper class white women to be infected rather than educated in order to protect the presumed sanctity of the Anglo-American home. In Mein Kampf, Hitler spent a chapter talking about Jews spreading syphilis throughout Europe. In a similar way, when the AIDS epidemic came to public attention in the US in the 1980s, many Christian fundamentalists proclaimed it as God's judgment for gays. This is a verse poem, a cover of a verse poem by a French author, Bartholomé, from 1951. And the reason I show it is that this trope of a woman with a beautiful mask who hides a diseased body and face underneath was so rife in Western Europe and American literature, poetry, and art that it really was, it's extraordinary to see the numbers of manifestations of this. Scene 4. Luhan's writings have often led me to some of my most original insights about her in the transitional years between Victorian and modern America. While I was once angry to have been denied her suppressed memoirs when I was a young scholar, I came to realize that my discovery of them late in my career elegantly paralleled Luhan's inability to write about them until her last years, urged on by Dr. Hausner, who believed they could be a means to exorcise the last of her demons. In my book, I argue that we must consider the impact of VD in a much broader way than it is normally written about, as impacting the eugenics movement, birth control movement, etc. I think we have to factor it into turn of the 20th century debates over women's rights and sexual orientation, the proliferation and female domination of Christian Science, and other movements that urged transcendence of the physical body, and the development of Freud's theories of psychoanalysis. While I certainly cannot engage all these subjects here, I want to offer a few provocative suggestions that Luhan's experiences have led me to have given me the realization of the extraordinary impact that VD has had on Western culture. Early 20th century doctors and social reformers in the US warned of a race suicide of the white middle classes, brought on by an escalating divorce rate, a militant women's movement, and the pollution of American by mongrel immigrants and unclean prostitutes. The public concern over VD coincided with the first sexual revolution of the 20th century, the pre-World War I period of which Mabel was a leading symbol. In fact, the first contemporary historian to write about Mabel Dodge, Christopher Lash, claimed that she was, quote, a 20th century pioneer in the cult of the orgasm, which is why I picked her as my thesis topic. You can imagine a young doctoral student being very intrigued by that comment, though it turns out not to be true. At the same time as social hygienists and social purity activists were preaching sexual continence, Freud and his more radical sexologist peers were condemning the ways in which what Freud called civilized sexual morality had created mass marital dysfunction, with particularly dire consequences for middle and upper class white women. Mabel was one of many new women who bought into Freud and free love in her endless quest to overcome the fatalism of heredity and environment to which she believed she was condemned by her Victorian upbringing. The talking cure and the sex cure both seemed marvels of liberation that would allow her to free herself from both sin and suffering. Many social historians have pointed out the ways in which the Freudian revolution was a defining element of modernity. But while it granted women their sexual natures, it also tied men and women to ideas of self that reinforced traditional gender binaries in the same name of psychic and social health, that women's essential selves were sexual and intended to serve men and maternity. This is not, however, the only link between the radical moderns and the old-fashioned Victorians. For the sexologists paid no heed to the ways in which their exuberant embrace of free love and their general contempt of contraception made modern women even more vulnerable to STDs than they were under the strictures of Victorian monogamy. The difference between the upright Victorian Edwin Dodge contracting syphilis from a French cocotte in Paris and the randy Maurice Stern contracting it from a native woman in Bali was that Dodge informed Mabel about it before he married her, while Stern remained blissfully unaware of it, having sex with Mabel and several other women until the disease was discovered during psychoanalysis. Mabel was not alone, of course, in suffering the depredations of male constructions of women's psyches, physical bodies, etc., nor in venereal disease being a salient factor in her mental and physical suffering. There's a whole subgenre of new women novels, mostly written in England, but some in the United States, by quite famous writers that deal with women who are either victims or avoid being victims of syphilis and gonorrhea. We know of many other such individuals, fictional and real, including the woman who was the subject of what is arguably Sigmund Freud's most famous case, Dora, published in 1905. Dora's father, who was having an affair with his best friend's wife, first went to Freud because he had contracted syphilis, which he apparently passed on to his wife. He had tried to pawn his 16-year-old daughter off on his lover's husband with little success, even though Freud thought that Dora should have sex with the husband of her father's lover, because it might help to cure her homosexual tendencies. This is quite a case study. Even before Freud published his case study of Dora, Ibsen's Ghosts, 1881, this is an image from a 2010 production at the Cotterwood Playhouse in Cape Cod, was the first play to publicly present the crisis of syphilis on stage. It revealed the ways in which VD lurked beneath the civilized veneer of bourgeois society. What is most shocking about the play today is the fact that the syphilitic hero, Oswald, hopes to cure himself by having sexual relations with the healthy working-class family servant Regina, who is saved from this fate only by discovering that she's his half-sister. I hope you're following all this. It was a common folkloric belief in Europe that virgins could cure syphilis in men, just as it has been in Africa since the AIDS outbreak, which has led to the rape of thousands of young African women. I'm going to go very quickly through some slides of works of popular literature and a few works of high art that deal with syphilis, mostly as subtext, but much more evident and obvious to contemporary readers than it would have been to 19th and early 20th century. This is, I don't know if anybody recognizes this story, this movie. Yes, The Portrait of Dorian Gray. Oscar Wilde wrote this in the late 19th century. This is a 1954 production. Dorian, he made a pact with the devil that if he was allowed to be as completely amoral and as possible and fulfill every single desire he ever had, that he would eventually give his soul to the devil. And this portrait was painted, and it shows his increasing debauchery over the years, and contemporary scholars have looked carefully at the language that Wilde used and seen that many of the descriptors of the portrait of Wilde, the debauched Wilde, contain syphilitic elements in terms of what's happened to his skin, his body, the various diseases that he suffers from. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, exactly the same, written by Robert Louis Stevenson, 1881. This is Basil Rathbone, performing it in the 1920s. Hyde also was the alternative, the alter ego of the good doctor, and he also manifested many of the symptoms of tertiary syphilis. The Phantom of the Opera was first performed in the 1920s, and much of the makeup that was used in this production was taken directly from descriptions by doctors of secondary syphilis. One of its worst effects is something called saddle nose, which is when the nose collapses inside the face, thus the mask. But most people who see Phantom of the Opera, 52 million around the world have seen it, do not know that is why he is wearing the mask. There was a wonderful production in 2006 by BBC of Dracula, which begins with the premise of the dying father of the young hero telling his dying of tertiary syphilis. You see him tied to his bed. It is absolutely a horrific scene. And his father says to him, "You cannot marry." And he's engaged to this gorgeous, pure Anglo-Saxon beauty. And he's walking out of his father's house after his father has died with a friend. And his friend says, "I know this guy in Transylvania who does blood transfusions." And immediately our young hero gets excited because if he can get all of the blood out of his body and put new blood in, he won't infect his wife to be. It's absolutely brilliant, fascinating production. And they're not really distorting the novel if you read it. There were also numerous artists, late 19th century, early 20th century, who portrayed syphilis. Edvard Munch did two paintings called Inheritance. And this is one of a working class woman with what doctors used to call syphilitic runts. That is, babies born basically at death's door with a lot of the markings of tertiary syphilis. And because Munch wanted people to know that it wasn't just poor working class women and prostitutes who transmitted the disease, this is a middle class mother with her baby, and the baby, of course, looks no healthier or any different. This is late 19th, early 20th century, these two paintings. Perhaps the ur-text of modern art, Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is about women prostitutes in a whorehouse, called demoiselles, ironically, since they are not ladies. Very confrontative, very aggressive. This is one of the earliest use of African masks in modern art. The earliest stages of this painting, the many sketches Picasso did, began with a doctor or a medical student coming into the whorehouse to check the prostitutes for syphilis. And this is one of those early drawings with a doctor sitting with a medical bag and a checklist, so it's kind of hard to see. During World War I, prostitutes were called treponema machines. Treponema is one of the Latin words for syphilis. Machine guns because they were thought to pollute and destroy the young men who were off fighting. This is an extraordinary piece by Louis Recamier called Hecatoma la Syphilis, and it's clear as it can be that a man who has sex with a woman whose disease is going to end up dead. I don't know how many people know this, but in the United States we actually had prison camps, not just for prostitutes, but for loose women, to keep them away from the virginal doughboys we were sending over to Europe in 1918. They were incarcerated from up to 18 months. Several thousand young women just taken away and put into essentially concentration camps. This is an Otto Dix portrait of Germany called Syphilis, 1920, and he's using syphilis as a kind of metaphor for the absolute devolution of culture, economics, political life in post-war Germany. This is one of my favorites. This is one of the first surrealist paintings that was ever done, 1929, by Salvador Dali. It's called Le Grand Masturbateur, and it has all kinds of puns about masturbation, and its relation to syphilis is this. When he was 11, his father sat him down and taught him sex by showing him a medical textbook filled with women and men dying of syphilis. So he said he refused to have sexual relations with anyone, even though he married a nymphomaniac who had lovers through her 80s. Very interesting life Salvador Dali had. This is a very famous mural by Diego Rivera. You would probably know it best because it was torn down by John D. Rockefeller in 1934 because it was supposed to be painted for the new Rockefeller Center, but Rivera put the portrait of Lenin right here. Much less well looked at is this side across from Lenin are these society ladies. And there's John D. Rockefeller leering at them holding a glass of champagne. And above their heads are floating spirochetes and gonococcus and typhoid. And one of the points that Rivera was making is that it's the upper classes who spread the venereal disease by the ways in which they exploit the lower classes. There was a wonderful play during the New Deal called Spirochete under the Federal New Theater Program, which taught the history of syphilis. This is a playbill from the 1938 production. They took the whole history of syphilis, beginning with Columbus through current times. They had nurses and doctors on hand to hand out condoms and to give advice on protecting yourself from venereal disease. It was soon after this that Connecticut was the first state to pass the Wasserman test requirement for a marriage license. And then it was followed by 38 other states in the next few years. This is a scene from the play. And then during the New Deal, you can go online to the Library of Congress and find these fabulous posters about trying to tell people about syphilis. This old menace to industry, don't lose your pay. She may look clean, but... Mabel's fears of sex and disease began with her father, Charles Ganson, who seems to have been responsible for her earliest associations of sex and death. As she wrote to a friend in the 30s, my father turned me into what is euphemistically called a frigid woman at an early age. In his case notes, Jelliff writes that Mabel's earliest memory was of visiting her father in a sanitarium where he'd been incarcerated for self-abuse, the Victorian euphemism for masturbation. And when I read that, I thought, that's crazy, but I read a book on it. It's true. They actually put people into quote-unquote insane asylums for masturbating in the late 19th century. She was also told that he had been banned from having sexual intercourse with her mother after Mabel was born because it made him insane. In her memoir, The Statue of Liberty, Luhan writes, all my years I have been victimized by the mysterious fatalities of the flesh. I have been made helpless and shamed and unable to determine what to do to save myself or anyone else. No one ever named them. When I was a child, I never heard the words syphilis or gonorrhea. I had been made aware of people whispering sometimes with their heads together about disasters in our town of Buffalo. When a young man everyone knew hung himself in his bedroom, naked except for a pair of white gloves, I heard my mother and her friends mumbling, "He had, you know." My mother said and drew down the corners of her mouth. So later, when I was old enough to be curious about what people did when they married, whatever it was all tied up with sin and forbidden acts and having that awful thing. Was Mabel's father syphilitic, a homosexual, or both? Why did sexual intercourse drive him insane? Was he suffering from paresis, syphilitic insanity, in his last years? Luhan's descriptions of his behavior are strikingly similar to those of Randolph Churchill, the father of Winston, in his last years. Why does Luhan write about her first affair, that she had to make love to John Parmenter to get the taste of her father out of her mouth? Did he sexually abuse her or just transmit to her his revulsion toward female flesh, at once menacing her burgeoning sexuality with his frightening prohibitions not to kiss boys, easing her into the gentle, unthreatening arms of young women, and sending her on her ultimate journey to what poet Adrienne Rich calls compulsory heterosexuality as a means of restoring a family circle she never had? Mabel's psychiatrist helped her through some of her darkest hours, many of which were related to the extreme manic depressive cycle she experienced throughout most of her adulthood. She maintained lifelong friendships with them, shared her writings with them, sent her friends and lovers to them. Yet her continual search for alternative therapies, occultism, Christian Science, theosophy, testified to their limited efficacy. These limitations were not just due to the lack of drugs available to treat bipolar disorders. The first drugs became available 2 years after she died in 1962. They're also due to the ways in which psychoanalysis reinforced her debilitating notions of self, inculcated by her Victorian upbringing and reinforced by her gurus Freud and Havelock Ellis. Woman's biology is her destiny, she was told. Her ultimate fulfillment could only come through raising and bearing children. And the only legitimate way she should experience sexual pleasure was by lying prone under the revered phallus and making sure she experienced orgasm in her vagina. Mabel's 1916 letters to Jelliffe convey all this information. Like Freud's Dora, she is a bundle of physic and psychic misery and defiance. Like Dora, Mabel places her most private fears and dreams at the behest of a brilliant man who tries to inscribe his own male fantasies upon her. Neither woman would be silenced. Dora was braver than Mabel. She cut off her therapy just as Freud believed he was on the brink of healing her, engaging in what I call a form of coitus interruptus that denied him the final illicit pleasure of unraveling her psyche. Mabel tells us in her published memoirs that she left Jelliffe after 6 months because he was too dogmatic and judgmental. For one thing, he insisted that her desire to cut off her long hair was a secret wish to share Phoebus Apollo himself. There is one letter of Mabel's to Jelliffe that is a particular goldmine of unintended Freudian ironies, and with this I will almost end my talk. Here we see clearly how Freud's psychological theories implanted, in the words of French critic Michel Foucault, the very scripts by which we recognize ourselves as sexual subjects. In other words, how Freud converted cultural codes into scientific ones. Mabel's letter also demonstrates the way that female patients could both comply with and subvert this agenda. It's the winter of 1916. Mabel is living at Finney Farm, Croton-on-Hudson in New York. She's undergoing analysis because of a continuing crisis of jealousy with her third lover, Maurice Stern, though she hasn't yet married him. Dear Dr. Jelliffe, here is a point on which I would like your opinion. When I started psychoanalysis, I told you I did it to get over jealousy. At the beginning of it, I told you I wanted to do creative work, and we believed you could free my energy, so I could. Then one day, you asked me to state to me what my problem, I asked you to state to me what my problem was, and you said to me that I use my maleness femalely and my femaleness malely. At the beginning of the analysis, you probed me to find my strongest desires. You will find, in turning back to your notes, that I told you I started life wanting 15 children. You have told me repeatedly that no relationship between a man and a woman was justified, save in that it was productive. And I have repeatedly told you that I wanted it so, I will, and I have never had relations with a man that I haven't consciously desired a baby, with my whole being yearning for it. So, of course, one reason I was neurotic was the struggle between my intense conscious desire to have children, which I tried to get in a male-dominating way, and according to your theory of opposites, a possible unconscious desire not to receive them. Well, your analysis got under my skin at last, and last week, just on the verge of being unwell, menstruating, the same thing happened again that happened 15 years ago. It wasn't only that the orgasm took place in the vagina, because that has occurred more or less ever since the analysis directed it there. You should have seen the response, 500 psychiatrists listening to this letter. If only they had that power today, right? To direct the orgasm to the vagina. But while that happened, my own will on that night seemed to me torpid, slow, indifferent. Some other will in me seemed to act, seemed to open up the walls of the uterus to receive the flow. My body and an unconscious will in me operated together while I, my own strong self, lay there, hardly doing anything more than observe. Now, I want your opinion of it. When what I have wanted for so long has come to pass through psychoanalysis, which proves indubitably that it must come to pass, When the world can use my kind of children, when I am economically able to do it, do you feel I ought to give up having it? I want you to understand that you must answer me as not answering a type, but as an individual. I don't see why I haven't a right to it if I can carry it off. I am not going to marry on its account. I don't feel sure enough of Maurice. And I don't see why women haven't a right. I call this part the Murphy Brown letter. Do you remember when she was castigated on television for being pregnant as a single mother? I don't see why women haven't a right to babies this way if they are strong enough to do so without having to lean back on a protecting male. Call me up and make an appointment and we'll talk about it someday. Faithfully, Mabel Dodge. Last scene. Mabel married Maurice Stern in August 1917 and sent him off alone on their honeymoon to Santa Fe, New Mexico. She joined him there in December and then shipped him back east 9 months later. When she took up the Pueblo Indians as her saviors in 1918, she was on her last flight from the many poisons of Western civilization, World War I and syphilis among them. In contrast to Maurice and the others Mabel had known, she wrote in the Statue of Liberty, the Pueblos, quote, seemed so clean and wholesome and free of the sin and decadence of the world, end quote. Mabel's Buffalo neighbor hung himself with white gloves on, according to Jelliff's notes, in order to cleanse himself of syphilis and homosexuality as well, perhaps. Dora's mother cleaned house obsessively, but she was never able to rid herself of the husband who defiled her home. Mabel's ambitions were much grander. She was hoping to establish, in Hemingway's words, a clean, well-lighted place in the high desert, a utopian colony of Indianized great souls who would help her write the gospel of a new world Eden. There is no doubt that Tony enabled her to give voice to this vision, even after he infected her with syphilis sometime in 1922 and 1923. Luhan writes that after this episode, they ceased to have sexual relations for the rest of their married life, which ended with her death in August 1962. In the winter of 1924, she began to write her memoirs. Thank you very much. Well, that was a lot to take in, but I'm very happy to answer any and all questions or listen to any and all comments. Yes?
Who was the father of her son?
John, her first husband was the father of her son, and he died in a hunting accident soon after the baby was born. She started the affair with the doctor actually before he died. And it went on for 4 years. It became like the town scandal, which is why she had to run off to Europe.
Did he have a normal life?
Yes. Oh, no, the son did not have a normal life. I don't know his whole story. He had many different careers in his life. He was head of the BIA at one point in New Mexico. He actually fought for Blue Lake. He was part of the delegation working to get the vote for Native Americans in New Mexico, and that vote didn't happen until 1948, which I think a lot of us don't know. He also worked for the State Department and CIA in Tehran in the 50s. He wrote 2 terrible novels. He was an alcoholic, and he was a terrible father because he had no real father, and his mother was hardly a role model. Any other questions? Yes?
Did syphilis occur in the Eastern Hemisphere before it was in the Western Hemisphere?
There are some records, there are bone records to indicate that a variant of syphilis that's called Yaws has been found in the ancient bones of people in Western and Eastern Europe. But what we know of a syphilis in the sort of modern world, which really takes off in 1493 after Columbus comes back on his second voyage, it had been gone, the bacteria had been gone for so many years that there was no immunity to it. It was the reverse of what happened to Native Americans in the Americas. As soon as they contracted smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, mumps, they were goners because they had no immunities in their system to withstand these diseases. And there is some kind of, I guess, grotesque irony in thinking that the one gift that Native America could give back to Europe for its conquest was syphilis. It is not, I would say there is very strong controversial evidence from every scientific report I have read that this is the way that modern syphilis came back to Western Europe. That if it was there before, it wasn't there. It had been gone for so many generations that no one had immunities to it. It isn't exactly scientific fact, but there's a lot of persuasive circumstantial evidence. And it was rife in Taos Pueblo. One of the first things Mabel did was have syphilis tests taken. And there was, in 2021, there was an extraordinary doctor here whose name was Eshref Shevki, and who worked with John Collier, who many of you know Mabel brought here, and who became eventually the director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs under Roosevelt. And something like 12% of the people in the Pueblo, the Wasserman test showed that they had syphilis. And Tony worked very hard, ironically, to get his friends in the Pueblo to be tested. This is before he himself contracted it. And when he did contract it, Mabel says he wouldn't believe her, but he had the symptoms. And she and her doctors, she had to go down to Albuquerque, she had to go to Sunmount Sanitarium to see Dr. Frank Mera, because the doctor in Taos, Doc Martin, as soon as he knew anything, he told everyone else in town. And everybody knew anyway, because everybody talked about it. Alice Corbin knew, her friends knew. You can't keep secrets in a community like Taos. It's too small. Or even in Santa Fe, for that matter. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I got a second one. Is the Dr. Hauser, is he a doctor who practiced here in Santa Fe?
Yes. He was one of the most wonderful people I have ever encountered in my research. When he died, there was a front page obituary for him that just went on and on about the fact that he treated everyone. I mean, he was Millicent Rogers' doctor, he was Mabel's doctor, but anybody who walked into his office or, who needed him, 24/7, he was out there, working with people. He really sounds like an absolutely extraordinary man. And there were all these commentaries. Every time Mabel wrote, when Millicent Rogers moved to Taos, Tony fell in love with her and Mabel went crazy. That's when she wrote the Syphilis Memoirs. So Millicent, in some ways, is partly responsible for her finally writing this story, because she was so angry at Tony and wanted her. And it was Hausner who said, I'm divorcing him. I can't stand it. He's always looking at other women. And it's true, he did. And he had sex with anyone he felt like having sex with. And Hausner said, don't divorce him. You've been married 40 years. Write another memoir. And on the last thing she wrote at the end of that doctor's memoir was, I can't write anymore. You know how I feel. And that was after 20, she'd written 20 memoirs. It's quite extraordinary. Yes?
Were you involved in any way with the documentary film?
Early on I was. I'm not now. I did several interviews with the producer. And he's, used some of my books, and he's mostly telling it from Mabel's point of view at this point, which I think is fine. He wants to kind of tell her story from the way she saw it, which is part of the truth, but certainly not the whole truth. Oh, no, he's appalled by all that. He doesn't want to talk about it. Not everyone is comfortable around the subject. But my granddaughter has a stuffed spirochete. She's 7 years old. You can buy all these wonderful bacterium online for your children or grandchildren if you want to, and teach them early. It's very cute, pink and curly. You have a TB bacillus. She has one too. She's very interested in infectious disease at age 7 for some reason. Well, thank you so much for your attention. I'd be happy to sign books if you want to buy one.